This video is sponsored by Squarespace, more on that later. Hi friends, my name is Al or Lilstarnerd. What's up? Before we get into it, I want to thank my patrons. Your names are on screen. Thank you so much for your support. I could not do this without you. If you haven't checked out my Patreon yet, please go do so. Here is the postcard and the sticker for this month. They are both inspired by my recent St. Augustine trip, and I think they're really cute, and I really love them. If you want them, sign up for my Patreon. We also do other stuff there every single month, like a podcast exclusive video, so go check it out. About today. We all know, if you've been around for a while, you know I love alcohol markers. It is one of my favorite mediums. It's kind of how I got my start, I would say. It's like one of my, it's been like one of my main mediums since the beginning, but I technically use them wrong, and people sometimes like to tell me about it. They like to remind me that I'm doing it wrong. See, I use them with mixed media and watercolor paper, which you're not really supposed to do. Basically, it's absorbent paper. It's meant to take wet medium, and so it will absorb a lot of the ink from the markers and basically suck them dry really fast. You know, maybe that's true. I'm not saying that that's not true, but I will say that I've never really had a problem with that. If it's a problem, it's minor, and I think it's worth it because I think it looks like markers look really, really pretty on watercolor paper. In fact, I get complimented for like how pretty my markers look, and I think it's because of the paper that I use it on. But you're supposed to use marker paper, and for a reason. It's not, you know, just to sell something else and make more money. It's for a reason. Marker paper is supposed to be bleed proof, you know, which is a big problem with markers. That's like a huge thing with sketchbooks, is people complain all the time about the bleed through. So, you know, if that's a really big problem for you, then marker paper would be a good option if you really don't like the bleed through. The bleed through doesn't really bother me too much, so like that's never, I don't care, you know. Also, apparently marker paper is better for blending. I guess instead of the ink being absorbed, it sits on top of the paper, so you have more time to like move it around. That's like technical side of it. Again, I don't really know if that's true. Like I believe it, but in my experience, also because the marker paper doesn't immediately absorb the ink, it won't like feather and spread like it does on mixed media or watercolor paper. There's no tooth, and again, there's no absorption, so you can get really nice crisp lines. Basically, overall, it's just better for your money, for your markers. It, you know, layers really nicely, and, you know, takes more layers. It doesn't soak up the ink, so you're not running through your markers really quickly. It doesn't require as much ink for the same effect. It's not dulling your colors, so they're more saturated. Overall, you know, it's paper made for markers, so markers are supposed to perform best on it. You know, there are valid reasons to use marker paper, and I've tried it a few times. I personally have never really experienced those benefits. In fact, those benefits tend to be what I see in watercolor paper. I tend to have issues with marker paper. But also, to be fair, I've never really given marker paper a fair shot. I've always used it very, very sparingly. You know, companies will send it to me and maybe want like a promo with it, so I'll do like just enough to make a post. I haven't really done a piece on marker paper. So today, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna give marker paper a fair chance. I have two brands of marker paper here. In my experience, these are the two that I have liked, or at the very least not hated when I've tried them. So we're gonna do some really basic tests on both of these papers really, really quickly, see if it can hold up to, you know, sketching and erasing, basic blending, see which one I like more, and then we'll pick one, and we're gonna do a portrait, and we're gonna test out marker paper. Let's go draw. Start with, well, first let's visually. This one is whiter, this one's much thinner. And they're not, normally what I don't like about marker paper is how plasticky it feels. These both feel like, basically like printer paper. Very, very smooth, but not that plastic feeling that I don't like. First thing I wanna know is, can it handle erasing? I think it's not getting probably as dark as it could, but no, I think that's pretty good. Okay, it's erasing fine. Wow, okay, that was good. We're gonna blend some colors together, just see how that does. Ugh, it feels so dry. Okay, I honestly don't love that. Okay, see, that's literally not budging. Here, let's try. It's kind of darker. Okay, all right. It's not to my standard, but it was also quick and it's not bad. It's not horrible. Let's see what happens with bleeding and doing multiple layers. It definitely pools. Took a second to dry. Well, so it is bleeding through, and that's wet, but it's not ghosting. Now I want to see if, one thing that I like about doing like a big block of color on watercolor paper is it kind of settles really nicely into like one, it evens out instead of looking really blotchy. But this, you can see every individual stroke and where it overlaps. Yeah, look how streaky that is. Don't love that performance. Already, this feels weirder to sketch on. Just a little like, less like paper and a little bit more plasticky. But nothing crazy. It did erase completely. Okay. This feels kind of like I'm drawing with a crayon. Like I can feel that wax coating making crumbs coming off. I already prefer this for the markers because look at how granulated this is just from one quick blend. Yeah, still not great, but so far I'm preferring this. Definitely staying wet right there. Very streaky. My markers feel drier. That's so granulated. So see how textured and granulated that is? That's weird. And then also up in the blending. And that's just from 3 layers. Also how streaky this is, but there is no granulating over here. Maybe a little bit over here. Before we get into the portrait, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is a great all-in-one platform for creatives, freelancers, entrepreneurs, etc. to represent themselves professionally online. And it's super easy to get started creating your website. Squarespace has a whole bunch of template options that you can choose from with all sorts of use cases in mind. So whatever you're going into, maybe you have a preconceived idea of what you want, or you want a very specific look for the specific thing that you do, they have something there for you already. But Squarespace knows that we're all unique individuals. We're all creatives out here. We need something that creatively represents us. And to make that happen, you can use Fluid Engine. Fluid Engine is a next generation website design software that's built right into Squarespace, and it fully functions as drag and drop. It allows you to fully customize every inch of your website. You can add buttons, galleries, animations, and you can put it anywhere on this little drag and drop grid. It's amazing. It's so easy to use. And maybe you have a shop that you want. You can do that on Squarespace too. You can sell on Squarespace, both in person and online. If you're selling in person, all you have to do is connect a Square Reader to your Squarespace app, and boom, all your customer info, inventory, all that stuff is synced up. Or you can set up your online shop on Squarespace, whether it's physical goods, digital goods, Squarespace has your back. If you're creative and you're looking to kind of further your own business or set up your business, I definitely recommend Squarespace. You can go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Lilstarnerd for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring. Thank you guys for checking out Squarespace. Now let's get into the portrait. I don't think I made it super clear in those last clips, so just so you know, the first pad I tested out was the Artex, and then I tried the Winsor & Newton paper, and I ended up going with the Winsor & Newton paper, just so we're on the same page. Anyways, I don't want to give any spoilers, but if you're one of those people who you don't like my more venti, negative, complainy videos, this one might not be for you. I think it's still a fun video. It's just my honest kind of first impression, first response to me trying this paper for the first time for real. So I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. But it is me talking a lot about my experience with the paper, which wasn't necessarily the most positive thing. So just, go into this with that in mind. It might not be to your taste. Anyways, I do want to be honest and say that I genuinely went into this believing that I could be proven wrong, and that there was a possibility that I was going to end up liking marker paper. I really thought there was a chance of that. However, I knew that unless this paper was super magical and somehow did all of the work for me, I probably wasn't going to just start using it. Even if I do like it, I just know I'm not going to start using it regularly, just because it just doesn't feel like it really makes sense with how I use markers in my regular practice. I usually use them In my sketchbook, I very, very rarely use them on loose pieces of paper unless it's a final piece. So like even if I like this paper, it'll just be an extra step in a process for me. So the chances are it's not going to happen. I'm not going to use it. And right off the bat, that was one of my major concerns with this paper. And it's definitely a reason as to why I wouldn't want to use it for final pieces or even just as like loose leaf doodle paper. The paper is just so thin. It's so, so thin. I don't know what the reason for that would be. Like maybe I don't know the reasoning behind most of the what goes on in marker paper or any paper, frankly. Maybe there's a reason for it. I didn't like it. It tears out of the pad very, very easily with no effort from me. Just from the paper sticking to and lifting with the kneaded eraser was enough to start ripping the page out. I really didn't like how easily the light shined through it. It was like printer paper. I wish I had done some tests of like layering the two drawn on pages over each other so you could see how much what's it called? Like, I don't know, ghosting through, how much you could see through to it. But I did not think to do that. This paper is so thin that when I used a really pale color, like the pale yellow, and then lifted the paper up, not even in front of a window, like just for the light to shine through, just lifted it up, and so there was nothing underneath it. It just looked like the paper was wet. Like there was no actual pigmentation. It was just making the paper wet with the alcohol. Obviously, that didn't happen with darker, more saturated colors, but I thought that it would make those lighter, desaturated colors more saturated, because I kind of thought that was the point. But no biggie, and that's also not exclusive to this paper with these really light colors. That happens on most paper. Those markers are basically just alcohol, so that makes sense. I'm just not used to it because I tend to work with thicker paper. So obviously, I'm doing a portrait. I thought about maybe doing two pieces, one being a detailed portrait like I tend to do with markers. That way I could see how marker paper would work with my specific process and how I use markers regularly, all that stuff. But then I was worried that, maybe that's not really the typical way markers are traditionally used. They're generally more like flat colors and gradient shading and like manga and comics, and that's maybe what the marker paper is for. So I was gonna do a second really quick, really fast drawing of, a stylized character where I would use the markers in a way more basic way. But then I was like, honestly, that's kind of dumb for like so many reasons. One, if it's made for markers, then it should be able to handle markers no matter how I'm using them, right? Or, within reason. Two, I want to test it for me, so I should use the markers how I use them. And three, it's not like the process I use is like so much more advanced than using it for comics or manga, which can also be super detailed and use a lot of colors, right? So it just seemed silly to do a whole separate test. But being on the other side of it now, I kind of wish I had done a simpler drawing as well. I'm going to jump the gun a bit and tell you that I think the first few layers were really where the markers functioned and looked their best. But also, at that point, all the colors were really, really similar, so they blended and layered really easily. So it was hard to tell if the paper was doing anything differently or if it was just like a really easy setup for it. I don't know. But I would have loved to know how some really simple block coloring and shading looked with those few layers. You know what I mean? It would have been a good test to do. I think it probably would have looked really good and performed really well, but obviously I didn't test it out, so I don't know. But my point is, I think that kind of art may be where marker paper works best, because the experience that I had, it was, I don't know, it was really weird. One of the things I have always hated about marker paper is the plastic coating. It feels super slick and weird and tends not to take pencil well. And I personally almost always, mix marker and colored pencils, so it's a huge turnoff for me. This specific paper wasn't slick or plasticky to the touch, which I loved. That was a great point, starting point. It had barely any sheen to it, so, that was great. But it did this really weird thing where, like, I felt like it made the markers feel really dry. Instead of the ink sitting on top and moving freely, like I thought it was supposed to, the first few layers seemed to sink right into the paper and not move very easily at all. In fact, the first few marks I made felt more like it was staining the paper than anything, and when I would try to buff it out into the paper, it didn't really budge. But even more strangely, that only seemed to happen for the first few strokes, because once I really got going and I started really laying down that first layer, it started working great. They looked great. Once the marker dried and it stopped looking like an actual wet stain, the marker seemed to blend into the paper really well. It seemed to kind of fade and settle. Like I said before, I think that part of the process is where the marker paper really had a chance to shine. When the layers were limited and the colors were similar, things went so smoothly and blended so beautifully. Looking back at my footage, I really am pleased with how easily I could blend out those really, really light colors right into the page with very little work. Also looking back, I noticed how easy it was to lay those colors down in general. For that first 2 layers, I could work really, really quickly, blocking in those light colors with the chisel nib, and it wasn't streaky or ugly or patchy, which I assumed it would be ugly based on the tests that I had done, where you could really see every single streak. I think the main difference is I was working with really light and desaturated colors, and maybe if I had been working with darker colors, it would not have been nearly as pleasant. One kind of negative-ish thing I did notice while working on those first few layers, though, was that layering the same color on top of itself didn't really do much. Normally, when I work on watercolor paper, I'll put down a layer of marker, and it of course dries lighter than when it's wet and after it's been absorbed a bit. So then I can go back in with the same color and layer over itself to get darker values, get more saturation in some areas. It's a great way to blend more smoothly, get a softer feel, to add more variation and value when you're working with limited colors, stuff like that. It's a trick that I utilize often. But here, I went in to start in on my second or third layer with a repeat marker, and I noticed that there was no point because it did nothing. So I just moved on to the next slightly darker marker. While it was slightly different to what I'm used to, I think the first few layers were pretty basic and easy. Nothing too drastically different or unexpected. But adding darker colors, even though they really weren't that dark at all, they were more like mid-tones at first. But anyways, darker colors, that's where it started to get weird. I do think darker colors did appear more saturated on this paper. So that, that's good, I guess. I don't know. At the very least, it's true to advertising. But anyways, I do think those colors were more saturated, but it's also really hard to tell if that's just because the paper was doing its thing or if it's a result of the layers interacting weirdly. Because they definitely were interacting very weirdly. It's very hard to explain or describe, to put words to it, but I would put a darker color down on top of a lighter layer beneath it, and it would I don't know, it would sometimes change colors instead of adding to the one below it. It would feel kind of slippery and almost like it was displacing the color beneath it rather than layering on top of it. Sometimes it felt like the ink was actually mixing rather than layering. I'm saying layering a lot, like that means anything. When I layer marker, I expect it to act like two colored plastic sheets on top of each other. Does that make sense? Or layers on Riso printing. They'll layer over each other to make new colors or change value, but they're not actually mixing together. But it kind of seemed to do that on this paper. It seemed like they were actually mixing, but only sometimes, because other times it seemed like it just replaced what was below it. It was really, really strange. Basically, when layering those darker colors, they interacted in ways that I did not expect at all and didn't know what to do with. And there were so many different ways that it behaved that I couldn't anticipate it, if it had less layers below it, if it would depend on the value or saturation of the color below it, whatever it may be. The new marker layer would act totally different depending on where it was on the page. And sometimes it would create an entirely different color in two different places on the page. It was very strange. Another thing that was a major roadblock for me was the way lighter colors acted when put on top of darker colors. Doing this is a major part of my process for blending, for neutralizing colors, for adding subtle tones, all sorts of stuff. When you use lighter colors on darker colors, you can actually sometimes lift it off the paper. Anyways, my point is, it's a very common thing to do. It's ingrained in my process, so of course I was going to do it here. But on this paper, it did most of the time nothing. It was just weird. Everything that I thought I knew, it didn't apply on this paper, and it was really confusing. Every time I tried to use a lighter color or blend something out, it really didn't do much unless it was a very similar color or a perfect mid-tone between the two that I was trying to blend together. When I was putting down really dark colors on the shaded side of her jaw, I kept going back in with lighter colors to try to blend it out, make it softer and more natural, just make it look less stark and alarming. And also I was trying to tone it down because the color did end up like way darker than I wanted. But no matter how much I tried with the lighter marker, it felt like that shadow just would not budge at all. The only thing it did was it kept getting more and more saturated. It was really weird and definitely threw a wrench in my entire like normal process. I think, as I've stated multiple times already, the paper can just only handle so many layers. After maybe 5 or 6 of them, the ink seemed to just sit on top of the other layers and it just got really hard to work with. And I think that amount of layering would be workable on some other sort of piece. Like, I think that's totally fine. But for something like this, of course, I'm going to be doing way more than just 5 or 6 layers, right? It was a lot harder to add subtle tones to things or really subtle shadows or gradients. You know, some areas of the paper that only had a few layers would take that mark and wouldn't let it go, and I couldn't make it lighter later. But then other areas wouldn't accept the mark at all. So it was just weird. It was really inconsistent. It made the paper unpredictable, and it kind of felt like I had to go at it with a much more graphic, all or nothing approach. I think going straight for the color you want would be better. Like, instead of slowly layering all over the paper like I do, actually keeping your color to the accurate local area might save you some hassle. It was definitely a weird feeling to me. It was like I said, just not what it didn't work for me. And then at the end there, I was so done with the process because it felt like I was working backwards. Like, everything I did was counterproductive. I kept adding marks, and in most places it didn't make a difference at all. So I called it quits. And oh my god, I was so annoyed. I already knew the paper would rip easily from when I was putting down the tape border. So I had made sure to stick the tape to my clothes to make sure, you know, it was less sticky. And still peeling the tape, it ripped so much of the paper. And the paper's already very thin, you know what I mean? So it was damaged so easily. It was wrinkled so easily just from handling it. I was so annoyed. It was such a hassle, and I definitely ended on a sour note, but I do think I still had a result. Like, I think working with it was really, really weird, but I don't think you can tell that from the result. I think the result looks maybe a little sloppy and lazy, but I think it still looked good. I think the piece looks fine, which I was kind of surprised by. Okay. This paper is so thin, it's not even funny. She's super wonky and crooked. Normally when I do a sketch, I usually do it like a day or two before. When I come to film the video, I'll look at it a second time, make some tweaks, and, you know, give my eyes a break before I start it. That's one of the many reasons I usually don't do a sketch on camera. But this time it was relevant, so I did the sketch right before, and you can you can see, god, it's so thin. You can see how crooked and wonky it is by flipping her over. But I still feel like I got to experience the markers, or the paper, I should say. I obviously haven't written the voiceover yet, and in the voiceover I will probably have more complete thoughts and a thorough analysis of my experience. Right now, I don't know how I feel. There were some pros, but I feel like there were a lot of cons. Of course, one of the big things is that I just am not used to it. It's definitely a different experience. It doesn't seem like it would be that different, but they perform pretty differently. And I just don't have the experience and the practice with that. And so I think if I did this consistently, cons would not seem like such a big deal. But, you know, I don't have practice using them like this. And so it was a bit of a struggle. Things just worked very, very differently. And obviously I'm biased, but I will say I think watercolor paper is easier, even in terms of like saturation. Like, I think one of the things that I've heard, like when I was doing research for like why is marker paper better, and I actually just recently talked to a few different artists and they brought up marker paper and talked about it. Like, they talk about how saturated markers look on marker paper. I don't feel like this is any more saturated than it is on more absorbent paper. And actually, you know what, I'm gonna take it back. I said pros. There's not necessarily pros, they're just like, it wasn't all completely sucky. So like there were some neutrals and then some cons. I didn't experience anything that I was like, wow, this is so much better here than it is on watercolor paper, except for maybe really light colors blended really well without like any help from me. That was probably the only pro. I do not think that I will continue to use watercolor paper. And this is no slander to this brand. I actually think that this was definitely not nearly as bad of an experience as it would have been if I used any other marker paper. It's slander to all marker paper, not to this company. I really don't like how see-through it is, and how thin the paper is. I didn't like it. I just didn't like it. I did not like it. It's not for me. But I, now stand by. I feel better about my statement whenever people are like, oh, you should really be using marker paper. When I go like, ew, I hate marker paper. I feel a lot more confident in being able to say that instead of it just being like, I tried it once and it wasn't great. Like, I scribbled on it once. I thoroughly tried it. And it's not horrible results. Like, I don't think it's, because I also like didn't put in, obviously this was more about trying the paper than it was making a good piece of art. So this isn't my normal effort amount that I put in. It's a little bit lazy. It's less detail than I would normally go. It's still a good enough result that it's not like, ew, marker paper did this. Like, it's still fine. Like, I think if I wanted to spend a really long time, I think it would take longer than it normally would. I think with maybe some extra time, I could make something as good as a normal marker portrait for me on this paper. I think it would take more time and more effort, and therefore it's not worth it for me personally. It was just more difficult to work with for me, in my opinion, based on what I'm used to. But let me know if you like marker paper, if that's what you regularly use. Let me know if you disagree. Like, is marker paper something that you really enjoy? Is it something that you prefer to use? I'm curious. I think this is something that objectively is unenjoyable, so I'm really curious to see if anyone out there like actually uses it. Because I also like, I talk about how I don't like marker paper, and every time I do say it, it kind of seems like there's gasps and like shock from the audience, right? But then it's like when I watch other artists' YouTube videos and I see their posts, I never see anyone else use marker paper. I feel like it's a fake supply. So I want to know if there's anyone out there who actually enjoys it. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, like, comment, subscribe, the whole shebang. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring. Thanks to my patrons. I'll see you next time. Bye.